Hello, I'm Anavultus, and today I'm going to talk a bit about my anti-populism. Now, there's a number of different ways people can oppose populism. However, I particularly come from a perspective of political realism. So, rather than, let's say, a more traditionalist perspective. So, I decided to explain why I don't think populism will lead to positive political outcomes, how I don't think it will lead to positive political outcomes, and also how populism, in my view, is actually used in society. So that those are some three categories, and to represent these three categories, I've got a total of 9 points here. Now I could make more, however, I think these are I believe the most straightforward arguments that could come to the top of my head by simply thinking about populism. So, first point, popular policies do not equal good or effective policies. So, I think that this point is, in my view, very important, and I think that even if this were the only point, it would be sufficient to, in my view, to discredit populism as a viable political movement. And that is because just because something is popular doesn't mean that it is good or effective. Now, that being said, good and effective things can be popular, and sometimes they are popular. However, I think that looking to the people to examine whether something is good or effective is less reliable than having a higher standard, a moral standard, perhaps an epistemic standard, a system of analyzing events. There's a number of different ways that you can come up with policies that are more reliable and more consistent in the long term than simply looking at what the people want. Now, that being said, I'm not saying that the wants of the people are politically irrelevant, because I do think that they are relevant, especially when it concerns the needs of a people. I do think that that is indeed politically relevant and should be addressed. However, if we're going to put everything up to a question of whether it's popular or unpopular, I don't think that that is the most reliable way to produce a stable political system. So, the second point, popular opinion can change easily according to modes or manipulation. And when I say modes, I don't mean modes as in the different modes of a machine. What I mean is mode as in the fashion, the trends. The word mode is used in the term modernity. Mathematically speaking, when you have a mode, it is the most common number in a set. So, what I'm saying here is that popular opinion changes, and it can change in the same way that fashion can change. It can change in the same way that popular music changes. And it can also be manipulated. That outside forces or forces that are not acting in the interests of the people can go in and produce policies that can become popular while also acting against the interests of the people. In that way, I do believe that populism runs into this problem. It is because saying that you are a populist can literally mean anything, because what the people want can change from time to time, and it can be contradictory over a longer period of time and can lead you into completely different directions. And this also leads into another problem. The larger a society is, the easier it is to manufacture consent. So I should have put a comma there. But anyway, what this means is that if you take a small group of people and you ask them to agree on something, it's pretty easy to tell who agrees and who disagrees. If you have a larger group of people, you end up with techniques that obfuscate who actually agrees with a position. You end up with, because not everybody is in communication with every other person in the group, because there are simply too many people to do that, or they are too far geographically, and even if technologically speaking that geographic limit is removed, there's still too many voices for it to be accomplished that people can understand truly what everybody else in the group is thinking. And this isn't to say that knowing what everybody else wants is important to populism, but it is to say that if you don't know whatever people want, you can be manipulated into thinking that other people want certain things that they don't actually want. And this is accomplished through a number of different techniques, and I might talk about this later, but there's ideas, for example, of the silent majority. That's an idea that essentially is a popular appeal, saying that certain ideas are popular, but the people who do hold these popular ideas aren't very outspoken about these popular ideas, and therefore, even though they do constitute a portion of the majority, they are silent in that. And that can lend to an illusion in regards to the popularity of certain ideas. And the fact is that some people are bound to bandwagon based on that. People want to jump onto ideas that are popular. People want to be part of the in-group. And if you manipulate what people think is the in-group, you can actually use that to manufacture consent. You can use that to construct this idea that a certain political movement is strong and popular, and it can become strong and popular simply due to the idea that it is strong and popular. So that's a manipulation tactic that a populist system can easily fall victim to, and therefore is another reason why I oppose populism. Now, moving on to a different idea, an idea on more the structural disadvantages of populism. Politics is a skilled profession. Now, this is controversial in some circles. Some people have this idea of a farmer then becoming a politician, similar to how the ancient Romans had this idea of farmers becoming great generals and statesmen. But in reality, the more time you invest into studying something, generally speaking, the more skilled and adept you will be at doing it. And there's a lot of people that have this opposition to career politicians. However, as society becomes more complex, it becomes necessary to have more specialized people to take care of more specialized tasks. And one of these fields that is becoming increasingly more specialized is politics. And this is similar to how medicine is becoming increasingly more specialized, where it used to be you'd have maybe one or two types of physicians hundreds of years ago, and now you can probably, if you're in the field, you can probably name 100 different types of medical professionals. So in that sense, you see that as skilled professions develop, as the body of knowledge grows, it also becomes necessary to understand that not everybody is equally skilled at accomplishing certain tasks, and having people who train to be skilled at a particular task is better than simply including everybody on that. And I'm not saying this to be anti-democratic, okay? I'm just saying that not everybody's opinions are equal in relation to politics. And I understand that some people like to say politics isn't an exact science. That may be true in some ways. However, realistically speaking, some decisions are better than others. Some policies are better than others at accomplishing certain goals. And having people that know which ones are better than others is better than having people that have to be persuaded on a surface level to believe that certain ideas are better than others. So, moving further, populism subverts the division of labor, and this is adding on to the other idea. Since politics is a skilled profession, just like medicine, just like law, as society develops and becomes more complex, as I mentioned, there are more types of doctors than there used to be. There are more types of medical professionals than there used to be. There are more types of lawyers than there used to be. As society becomes more complex, it also becomes increasingly necessary to divide certain types of labor because fields of knowledge become so large that it's not possible for any one person to have a full and complete knowledge of all of the human experience, all of human expertise. Maybe a very long time ago that might have been possible, but as things become more complex, that's no longer possible. And that being said, therefore, it makes sense to decide that some people can train to be better suited at making decisions than others, because if we were to simply say that everybody's opinion was valid, then we get to the next point. Populism dilutes expertise in decision making. Because as the division of labor increases, the chances of someone being proficient at making a decision in a certain field statistically decrease because there are more fields. There are more fields of expertise, and as the number of fields of expertise increase, it becomes more difficult to find someone who is an expert in that field, because it becomes necessary to have more and more experts on different topics. And this is where the division of labor comes back in, because that is why we have a division of labor, because it would be incredibly inefficient if everybody had to be skilled at all the same things. We, as a society, as a civilization, as I say, the division of labor is foundational to civilization. As a civilization, we would not be able to progress technologically. And if we are not able to progress technologically and philosophically, then we end up in a situation where, from a realistic political perspective, we run into a disadvantage against potential adversaries who are able to progress technologically and philosophically and are able to, therefore, defeat our society due to the greater complexity of their society. So we have to think in concepts of power dynamics. So speaking of power dynamics, number 7, popular sovereignty does not correspond to real power dynamics. What does that mean? That means that the idea that the people are sovereign in a country. The idea of popular sovereignty, while a lot of people believe it, the fact that a lot of people believe it doesn't make it true. And this has to do also with the division of labor, because not everybody is concerned with political events. Not everybody is interested in becoming involved politically. Not everybody is willing to spend the time to be politically engaged. And this leads to a situation where the number of people who are therefore actively involved in politics is lower than the total population. But then you actually shave off the people that actually hold power. And in a society where people hold power, where there is a hierarchy, where there is leadership, where you have archons rather than anarchy, which is more efficient, by the way, due to the division of labor. The people who hold power are generally more powerful than the people who don't hold power, even in a collective sense. Now, that's not saying that if everybody not holding power were to get together and rebel, that they wouldn't be able to overthrow the people who are holding power. But it is to say that, historically speaking, compulsory empires that rule through fear, through strength, are capable of ruling larger populations than their ruling class. In other words, tyranny is more effective than anarchy, historically speaking. That is to say that if you have a society where one half decides to get rid of leaders and have an anarchy, and another side produces a tyranny, and they have a disagreement and conflict erupts, the tyrant is more likely to conquer the anarchic society than the anarchy is likely to depose the tyrant. Similarly, in an anarchic society, there is a decent likelihood of the development of tyranny. Now, actual anarchic societies are extremely rare and short-lived, as you would expect. And there are a number of societies that people say are anarchic, but really aren't. So I'm not really going to get into that debate. But realistically speaking, having leaders is more effective than not having leaders. And sovereignty is usually held within power structures as opposed to within a general population. Functional sovereignty, that is. Now, people have symbolic sovereignty. However, look at any country that symbolically places sovereignty in the hands of the people, and you will see that the functions of sovereignty are indeed held by the power structures. And you might say, well, the people in power are elected by the people. Then the question then becomes, why is it that in liberal democracies where populism should be strongest, okay, the liberal democracies where populism should be strongest fail to satisfy populists? Which is interesting, because in a liberal democracy, there is very little obstacle for a populist movement to rise. There's very little obstacle for the will of the people to be expressed. However, why is it that in liberal democracies, populists still feel like they're not actually expressing the will of the people? And I think this is very telling. This is sort of like socialism, okay? Because in socialism, you have a scenario where someone tries to achieve socialism, they change the political system, and then later on, people will complain that this isn't actually socialism. We're not actually moving towards socialism. Why aren't we moving towards socialism? Something is wrong. The system has been subverted in some way. We're not actually moving towards socialism. The same is true for populism in liberal democracies. The populists think that if they get their vote, they think that if they are able to express their will, that they will be able to actuate the will of the people in their government and in their society. But factually speaking, it doesn't end up that way, or at least not in the way that many of them imagine that it would. And this speaks to the failure of populism as a political movement. And why does it fail? Now, that being said, sometimes, on rare occasions, populists do get the person in charge that they would like to have in charge. However, I will mention that in reality, populism is a tool used by politicians to gain and hold power by using the will of the people as a justification. So when people complain, let's say in the United States, that the Democrats and Republicans aren't very populist, then what I say is, well, why is it that the Republicans use language like the silent majority? Why is it that both Democrats and Republicans use populist language to indicate that they are on the side of the people, that they are expressing the will of the people, and they win elections, but it doesn't actually happen? The answer is that, number one, these people do claim to be populists, and are in a country where they do have a liberal democracy. But what's actually happening is that since populism is, realistically speaking, not an effective way to get consistent policies, actual politicians, most politicians who are in power, understand this, and therefore the most useful populism is to them is as a tool to persuade people to vote for them, to persuade people to manufacture consent to their policies, to persuade people to demonstrate some type of popularity. And that is the fundamental failing of populism. That is the failure of populism. That as much as people want their politicians to represent them, or in a direct democracy, they want effective policies, the system of populism, the practice of populism, doesn't actually provide an effective way to get there from A to point B, which means it ends up being co-opted by other movements in between. And it has to be. And why does it have to be? Because popular policies don't equal good or effective policies. Popular opinion can change easily according to modes or manipulation. The larger a society is, the easier it is to manufacture popular consent. And politics is a skilled profession. Populism subverts the division of labor. Populism dilutes expertise in decision making. Populism is an idealistic position competing in a real world. So in the realist, idealist dichotomy of ideologies, since populism falls onto the idealist side, but we live in a real world and not an ideal world, it has to be expressed through real events. It has to be converted into real policy, and when it is converted into real policy, it loses its ideal aspect and necessarily ceases to be populism and ends up becoming whatever the politicians want to peddle to the people. And this can be exploited quite easily by political organizations, especially in larger countries. And ultimately, you end up with a situation where you'll have a popular person come in and make a popular appeal and take power and appropriate power and push society in a situation where even if he were to become unpopular, he wouldn't be able to lose the power, essentially becoming a tyrant. And this is why populism has a bad reputation among politicians, even the most, even some of the very left-wing politicians that are very much saying we need to express the will of the people, which is a populist phrase, but then they go back and when somebody says, "Oh, I'm a populist," they condemn it, and the reason is because that is the end of populism. Populism leads to a chain of popular appeals and disappointments until eventually you reach a tyrant and the chain ends and you change into a different political system and populism is no more, and therefore populism is a self-destructive political ideology. But anyway, that's just my opinion. Tell me what you thought. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you have a different view of populism? Do you have a different view of anti-populism? I'd be happy to hear from you all, my beautiful audience. Thank you all for watching. Anavultus over and out.